Shalom from Alon Shvut. Our topic today, should anyone dance with the Sefer Torah, takes on an added dimension of poignancy right now when we're in the thick of the coronavirus pandemic. And I would add that as director of Deracheha, womeninmitzvot.org, I'm definitely more used to addressing the question of whether women can dance with the Sefer Torah. But I think to understand that question, and even also to talk about what we should do this year with coronavirus, we need to look at the broader issue of what it means to dance with the Sefer Torah, specifically on Simchat Torah. To do that, there are a few topics I want to cover. I want to talk about, in general, how we show Kavod to a Sefer Torah. We're going to talk about ritual impurity, tuma, in the Sefer Torah. And then I think it's important for us to understand something about the evolution of the celebrations on Simchat Torah. And then we're going to get into some discussion of more recent developments about who's dancing with the Sefer Torah in Batei Knesset. Okay, so to get started with the question of showing Kavod to a Sefer Torah, it's interesting to think first about what a Sefer Torah is and what it means, what it is that we show Kavod to it. So for example, the Talmud in Kiddushin, when it talks about the question of whether we should stand for a Sefer Torah, learns it from a Kal V'chomer, from a human being. The Talmud says, "Ibailuhu ma'olam mod mipnei Sefer Torah." So what's the halacha about standing before a Sefer Torah? Rabbi Cholkia, Rabbi Simon, Rabbi Elazar Amri, Kal V'chomer, mipnei lomdeo umdim mipnei lo kol shekain. If we stand before the people who learn Torah, i.e. a Talmid Chacham, who contains Torah, how much more so that we should stand for the Sefer Torah, which is interesting because, of course, the Sefer Torah isn't an animate object, and yet the Sefer Torah is a repository of this holiness. The Rambam, when he talks about why it's so important that erva, nakedness, not be exposed before Sefer Torah, he says, "Dvarim shebeluchot habrit hein shebechol sefer v'sefer." These are the words that were in the Luchot HaBrit, or the words that in the Sefer Torah. The Sefer Torah even starts to represent something beyond itself. When the Rambam talks about what it means to sit in front of a Sefer Torah, he writes as follows: Kol mi sheyoshev lifnei Sefer Torah, yoshev bekoved rosh be'ema b'fachad. If you're sitting before a Sefer Torah, you have to do it with a certain tone. It has to be with a certain sense of awe or even of fear. Shehu ha'ed ha'ne'eman l'chol ba'ei olam, because our Sefer Torah is a witness to all those in the world of what our people believe in. And that's what it says in Parshas Vayelech. V'aya sham b'cha le'ed. When we talk about the Sefer Torah that's put by the original Aron HaBrit, that Sefer Torah is there as a form of edut, a form of witnessing to our Torah min hashamayim. V'chabduhu kefi kocho, and it's our responsibility to honor the Sefer Torah to the best of our abilities. Amru chachamim harishonim, kol ha'mechalel et haTorah gufo mechulal al habriot, v'kol mechabed et haTorah gufo mechubad al habriot. So someone who honors the Torah is honored by others. Someone who desecrates the Torah is also in effect going to be desecrated by others. Or what the Rambam is effectively doing is he's saying this Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, which is not talking actually specifically about the book, the scroll, it's talking about Torah per se, the metaphysical Torah, is worth quoting here in the halachos of Kavod to Sefer Torah to show us that the Sefer Torah really represents the broader metaphysical idea of Torah itself. And that's why we stand for it. That's why we accompany it from place to place. That's why we don't expose erva in front of it. That's why also our hands cannot be dirty handling the Sefer Torah. There's a range of ideas about how we have to show respect to Sefer Torah. The Hushalmi even says, talking about Beis HaMikdash and Yom Kippur with astonishment, how could it be that the Sefer Torah was handed from person to person? And the Yerushalmi says, well, really, we need to understand. B'chol atar atamar holchin achar Torah. Every location, everywhere else, what do we usually say? We go after the Torah. The Torah doesn't go after us. For example, if you want to kiss the Torah, you're supposed to make the effort to come close to the Torah. You're not waiting for the Torah to approach you. So we treat the Sefer Torah with a great deal of respect. And of course, that's going to be something that we're going to need to look at when we're talking about dancing with the Sefer Torah, because it's not clear exactly how that idea in the Rambam of sitting in fear before a Sefer Torah is going to be effectively translated to a context of simcha and dancing and motion. Okay. Second piece of background before we start talking about Simchat Torah has to do with the Sefer Torah and impurity. Now we say that the Torah does not receive impurity. This is based on a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, Chod vari ka'esh ne'um Hashem. My words are like fire, says God. Ma'esh eno mekabel tumah, af divrei Torah einam mekablin tumah. Fire doesn't receive ritual impurity, so too words of Torah. The idea is that the Torah doesn't receive ritual impurity such that even people like who are impure, like a woman right after childbirth, or a zav, a man with an unusual emission, they're all permitted to read in the Torah. And the Rambam takes a Tosefta that says they're all permitted to read from the Torah, and he adds that that also means that they're able to physically hold the Torah. By reading, we don't just mean learning Torah, we mean that someone who's ritually impure, says the Rambam, kol atmein, vafilu nidot, anyone who's ritually impure, including women who are menstruating or have menstrual impurity, mutar lachol sefer Torah v'likrot ko. Any of these people who are ritually impure are permitted to hold the Sefer Torah and to read from it. And the Shulchan Aruch paskins this way. It would seem then that in terms of ritual impurity or concerns about modern day ritual impurity, what could they be? They could be a man with a seminal emission or a woman in nida, for example. That kind of concern when it comes to handling the Sefer Torah, transmitting impurity to the Sefer Torah, doesn't seem like it's a concern from Tosefta, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch. What's interesting, though, is that there's a custom that developed among women to be particularly cautious around the sacred during periods of menstrual impurity. We already see in Gaonic times that questions are being asked about this. They asked Rav Yehuda Gaon, Nida mao le'tzluye olamea lebeik nishta. They asked Rav Yehuda Gaon, is it acceptable for a woman with menstrual impurity to daven and to come into shul? He says, sure. The fact that they're asking the question already shows that there's some sort of a perception, or you could call it a spiritual intuition, that maybe these things don't go hand in hand. And there's a source called the Braita of Masechet Nida, which is actually of unclear provenance. Even though it's called Braita of Masechet Nida, it's not really a Braita from Tannaitic times. And it's not clear that all of the material within it is from the same era. It's not clear exactly where it was developed. It's kind of a funny work, but it gets cited sometimes. And the Braita of Masechet Nida quotes the pasuk by a woman who's just given birth, a postpartum woman who has ritual impurity and is not supposed to come into the mikdash, Ve'el mikdash lo tavo, and derives from that a woman in nida shouldn't be coming into shul and shouldn't be coming into a beit midrash whatsoever, which is surprising if we think about what we just saw or just talked about in the name of Rav Yehuda Gaon. We think about what it says in the Tosefta. Where was she coming? Where was Zava going to be reading and holding a Torah, if not in Beit Knesset? So it's sort of an interesting idea. And it seems that in the Middle Ages, this idea really took hold. So the Ravia, for example, says like this. He's in 12th to 13th century Germany. He says, "V'anashim na'agu silsul ba'atzman u'prishut be'et nidutan she'en nichnasot levet hakneset." The women made some kind of like careful boundary for themselves that they weren't going to show when they were in nida in Germany in the 12th to 13th centuries. And now he's referring to, I saw this in something that's called the Braita Masechet Nida. He also has some questions about its provenance. And then he continues and he says, this custom is good, it's fitting. Like we say with a man who has a seminal emission, I've heard that there are people who are lenient about it. I've heard that there are people who are stringent about it, and being stringent about it is very meritorious. From that we can learn about other cases. What's so interesting here about the Ravia is two things, really three. Number one, the effect of this grassroots custom among women, which he's basically giving a stamp of approval to. Number two, that he is connecting it, comparing it to a man with a seminal emission. And number 3, that based on that, he's saying that it's a proper minhag, just as it would be with a man with a seminal emission. That's particularly interesting because, of course, men in that situation, in fact, don't, generally speaking, preserve that custom. In Hasidic communities, it's fairly common for men to go to the mikveh every morning, which is sort of harkens back to the original Takana of Ezra. But that's not really in practice in very many communities that men regularly immerse before coming into shul. So it's kind of interesting that the Ravia is comparing the female practice almost to paralleling of not going into shul when needed, almost as a parallel to something that men might do, but also within that framework, well, you could be careful about it and you could not be careful about it. It's still very much in the realm of custom and not requirement. Now, his student, Rav Yitzchak Or Zarua, says, "V'yesh nashim nidot nimnaot milikanes lebeit knesset." He says there are women who are in nida who don't enter into a beit knesset, and then he says, "Umiliga b'sefer." And these women are also careful about not touching a Sefer Torah. So what we learn here is that on the one hand, we have this fundamental halacha, Tosefta, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, that women and anyone who's ritually impure can handle a Sefer Torah. And on the other hand, we have this kind of grassroots custom, which gets rabbinic approbation, which is kind of harkens to the Braita Masechet Nida, and then gets picked up, and the Ravia is talking about it, and his student the Or Zarua is talking about it, that this is what women are doing. They're not going into shul, and they're also not touching the Sefer Torah. And that's met with approval. Yafeh Henosot, says the Or Zarua. And at the same time, what's kind of interesting is that this is not something that's universal, that's picked up everywhere, and it's not something that lasts for a very long time. So for example, the Beit Yosef says, Nashei Didan lo naog limana klal milikanes lebeit knesset. Beit Yosef says, no, our women, he's in Turkey, he says, our women don't have any hesitation about going to Beit Knesset at any time of month. Trumat Adeshin, Rav Yisrael Yisraelin, in 14th to 15th century Austria says, Ve'al nashim be'et nidatan, emet hitarti lehem biyamim hanoraim v'chi agavna, sherabot mitasvot lebeit knesset, lishmoa tefila u'kriyah. He says, I let them. Why does he have to let them or give them permission? He has to give them permission because sometimes a custom, if one takes it upon oneself on a regular basis, a custom can take on sort of a form of almost being like a neder. And he says, I told the women in my community that they can go to shul without hesitation, whether or not they're in nida, at the time of Yamim Noraim, and also at other times, at times when it's customary for people to gather in shul, there's no hesitation about letting women come to davening and encouraging them. Why? And he says, Shilchu lebeit knesset, that's a heter. Samachti Rashi shematir bilchot nida. I'm relying on Rashi. Furthermore, mishum nachat ruach lenashim. He quotes a Gemara in Masechet Chagiga that talks about how in the time of Beit HaMikdash, women were allowed to perform smicha or leaning on sacrifices, even when it wasn't obligatory, and even when there might have been a halachic concern about what's called avodat b'kodshim, making inappropriate use of sanctified objects. Women were allowed to do this in Beit HaMikdash because it was nachat ruach lenashim. It provided a sort of spiritual gratification or satisfaction to women to be able to do these acts. So now here, the Trumat Adeshin is saying, when everyone's going to shul, and a woman might hesitate because her custom is not to go to shul when she's in nida. But let's say it's Yamim Noraim, it's Rosh Hashanah, and everyone's going to shul. Yes, the women should go. It's nachat ruach, it's important spiritually, and not only that, hayu lahen leitzbon ruach machlat lev shekol mitasfim liot b'tzivur v'hem yamdu chutz. This is something that's particularly resonant right now during Corona, what it means to not be allowed to go to shul. He says, women who wouldn't be able to go to shul during Yamim Noraim, it would be heartbreaking for them. It would be absolutely heartbreaking to keep them out, that everyone else is gathered and they're on the outside. There needs to be room. And Ramah paskins like the Trumat Adeshin. Now, what's interesting about the Ramah, before he paskins like the Trumat Adeshin, as he says that actually this minhag of women not going to shul while in nida is only kept when women are actually bleeding. He says, Bimei libun nagu heter. When a woman is stopped actively bleeding, the practice is actually not for a woman to refrain from coming into shul. When women are actually bleeding, the practice is to refrain from coming into shul. But when a woman has stopped bleeding, even though she's not yet immersed in the mikveh, she still goes to shul. Now, the Ramah is so important because up till now we've been assuming, based on the history of discussion about women with menstrual impurity and other people with different forms of impurity, we've been assuming that the framework behind this practice of women refraining from coming into shul or from touching a Sefer Torah had to do with Tuma and Tara. When the Ramah says that there's a difference between when a woman is actively bleeding and when a woman is still in nida, has not gone to the mikveh yet, but is no longer actively bleeding, it's very hard to say that we're really talking about Tuma and Tara anymore at all. Because the Tuma of nida, menstrual impurity, doesn't change till the woman is immersed in the mikveh. The fact that she stopped bleeding doesn't actually make a difference. So what could the Ramah be getting at? Well, Rav Yaakov Emden suggests, and also the Kaf there are some later authorities who suggest that the Ramah must be suggesting here, not even just in the name of the Ramah, talking about the custom as a whole. The custom, this grassroots initiative by women to refrain from going into shul or touching a Sefer Torah during nida, maybe it's really not about purity or impurity, Tuma and Tara. Maybe it's more about just a sense that it's inappropriate when things are a little messy or a little bloody. This makes a lot more sense if we think about the difference between menstrual hygiene products of today and what would have been available a very long time ago. It might have been a real fear that there could be some kind of a leakage or something like that in going in shul, and it might have felt inappropriate if a woman wasn't certain that she would remain externally clean. It might actually have been more akin to issues of Kavod Torah, which include that one's hands have to be clean when handling a Sefer Torah, which have to do with hygiene, than about nida or ritual impurity per se. In any case, this is something that we see starts to fall out of practice even in Ashkenaz. We saw the Beit Yosef was saying that in Turkey they didn't do it. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't pask in this way. The Ramah is lenient during a woman's clean days, and on Yamim Noraim he paskins like the Trumat Hadeshin, and really already the Agur in the 15th century Germany is already saying, Ani mechaber ra'iti b'mdinati noagin anashim likanes levet hakneset mipalalot. He's saying, women aren't practicing this anymore. And even in recent times, the Mishnah Berurah says, Midinotenu noagin heter la'olam, that this is really no longer practiced. There's kind of one real residual element of this that the Mishnah Berurah mentions. It also comes up in the Chai Adam, which is still sort of a mystery to me, and that's looking at the open Sefer Torah during Hagbah, that apparently there was a practice and that among many still remains in place of dafka specifically not looking at the Sefer Torah during Hagbah when a woman is ritually impure. And it might be that if that was the practice, that it would also be the practice of not touching the Sefer Torah, but it's not really written clearly anywhere. So we have two pieces of sort of interesting background before we start moving into the question of what's going on in Sefer Torah. Piece number one, Kavod Torah. Kavod Torah, the sense of having fear and awe around the Sefer Torah and treating it with great honor and respect. Number two, this kind of women's custom, which might have had to do with ritual impurity and might really have just had to do with hygiene, about when it was comfortable for women to approach the sanctum, to enter into shul, and also in some cases there's discussion also of whether that meant that they were touching or looking at a Sefer Torah. So those are kind of in the backs of our minds, but really neither of them seems to give us decisive guidance. Both of them would seem to err on the side of caution around the Sefer Torah, but neither is saying that there's a prohibition. After all, we saw in the Tosefta, we saw in the Rambam, someone who's ritually impure can touch it and handle the Sefer Torah as well. Okay, well, what about Simchat Torah? How did we wind up dancing with the Sefer Torah and Simchat Torah to start with, especially given the care that we take with Kavod Torah? One would think that on Simchat Torah, when we are celebrating the Torah, that's the time when we especially would want to be showing kavod to the Torah. So how did that kavod wind up being translated as the sort of freewheeling dancing that so many of us are accustomed to? Well, Simchat Torah might have its forerunner in Simchas Beis HaShoeva, right? Because Simchat Torah is coming at the tail end in Chutz La'aretz. It's the Yom Tov Sheni of Galios. In Eretz Yisrael, it's Shmini Atzeret, but it's coming at the tail end of the Sukkot season. And the Sukkot season, Zman Simchatenu, is especially marked by celebration. In particular, we know about the Simcha Beit HaShoeva, of the festival of the water drawing, where they would get the water from the Shiloach, that would become the water libation on the Mizbeach, on Sukkot. And here, the Rambam describes the Simcha in pretty colorful terms. Mitzvah la'arbot b'simcha zo, v'lo hayu osin ota amei haaretz v'chol mi sheyirtzeh, ela gdolei chachmei Yisrael v'roshei yeshivot v'sanhedrin v'chasidim v'azkenim v'anshei maseh, הם שהיו מרקדין ומספקין ומנגנין ומשמחים במקדש בימי חג הסוכות, אבל כל העם, האנשים והנשים, כולם באים לראות ולשמוע. The Simcha in Simchas Beis HaShoeva was very vibrant. The Mishnah tells us that if you didn't see the Simcha in Simchas Beis HaShoeva, lo ra'ah simcha al miyamav, you haven't seen Simcha ever. It's a very vibrant kind of Simcha, but what's interesting is who's kind of being actively mobile or actively taking the lead in this Simcha, who's really moving, dancing, says the Rambam, during the Simcha? And the answer is that the people who are dancing in Simchas Beis HaShoeva are not your common man and not your common woman. The people who are dancing in Simchas Beis HaShoeva are specifically the wise men. They're specifically Chachamim, Roshei Yeshivos, Sanhedrin, Dayanim, people who are particularly known as Chasidim. It's not actually a free-for-all. There's a role that's being played by those who are bayin l'rot v'lishmoa. The common person on Simchas Beis HaShoeva participates in the Simcha by watching the dancing, by watching the clapping, by watching the pounding. Again, this seems pretty distant from what we do in this later evolution of Simchas Torah. Now in Simchas Torah, it's even harder to understand how we dance, because on Yantiv, there's an Isser D'Rabbanan to be involved in dancing and clapping. It says in Masechet Beitza, ve'elu hen mishum shvut, lo metavchen, lo metzapkin, v'lo meraktin. We don't pound to make noise, we don't clap, and we don't dance. Those are all prohibited, generally speaking, on Yantiv. So how is it that we do it? So allowances perhaps can be made, but already in Gaonic times, something very interesting that comes out in Bavel. Now in Bavel, it's very significant in Simchas Torah, because Bavel is where they had the annual Torah cycle reading, which could end in Simchas Torah. In Eretz Yisrael, it makes sense that Simchas Torah as a time to celebrate Torah didn't evolve as quickly, because in Eretz Yisrael, there's a triennial reading cycle. It's not every year in Simchas Torah that you finish reading, but it's every 3 years that you finish reading. Lav dafka in Simchas Torah either. So in Shuvas HaGaonim it says, Yom Tov Sheni Zeh, Shehu Acharon, רגילים אצלנו שמרקדין אפילו כמה זקנים בשעה שאומרים קילוסים לתורה, על שזו משום שבותו, מנהגו בו התר, ביום זה בלבד, לכבוד התורה. Ordinarily, we say don't dance. But on Simchas Torah, already the Gaonim are telling us that in Bavel, to celebrate the Torah, the Zkenim, again, it's not the whole shul. It's specifically the elders. Some of them themselves are dancing, and they're dancing while they're singing. I'm sorry, they're not dancing. Yes, they are dancing. They're dancing while they're singing for the Torah. And it's a special heter for Simchas Torah, even though ordinarily this is not something that we do on Yantiv. Now, we don't have a lot of data about how this practice evolves. There's a monumental, fantastic book by Dr. Avram Yari about the Toldot, the history of the evolution of the holiday of Simchat Torah, and dancing is only one small part of it. One of the next and important sources that talk about dancing is the Ramah. The Ramah talks about the practices in Simchas Torah. First of all, he talks about the Chasen Torah and the Chasen Breshit, and you know that the custom of them sponsoring a kiddush is already there, codified in halacha, that it's a good idea. And then he moves on and he says, "Ve'od nagu b'mdinot elu, lotzi b'simchat Torah, arvit v'shachrit, kol sifrei Torah shebeichal, v'omrim zmirot v'tishpachot." In honor of the Torah, we're taking out all the sifrei Torah from the Aron, We're bringing them all out, which is not what we ordinarily do. They're all being brought out, and we're singing before them. Kol makom lefi minhago, that's also very important. Every place has its own specific custom about how this works. So there's already from the beginning a diversity of custom of how you honor the Sefer Torah or the Torah itself that it represents in Simchat Torah. Ve'od nagu lahakif im sifrei Torah habima shebevet hakneset, kemo shemekifim im halulav, v'akol mishim simcha. Suddenly now the Sefer Torah is moving. Before, we had the idea that in Simchat Torah in Bavel, the Zkanim, the elders of the congregation, are dancing in front of the Sefer Torah while they're singing in honor of the Sefer Torah. Here, we have something a little different. We have singing for the Sefer Torah. He doesn't mention here dancing. And then we have taking the Sefer Torah in a circuit around the bima. All the Sifrei Torah that are in the shul are going to circuit the bima as sort of an extension of the experience of Hoshanos during Sukkot. And while on Sukkot we take the lulav and etrog, which are part of the mitzvah of the Yom, you can see that the symbolic significance would be we're making the transition to Simchat Torah, where the mitzvah of the Yom, the object of mitzvah of the Yom, is the Torah scroll itself, and that's what we're moving around to encircle the bima with as we're singing in its honor. Okay, so it's sort of another step closer to what we recognize. We certainly do make these hakafot, these circuits now, but it's not quite the same as the dancing that many of us have in shuls. This really becomes popular to dance in shul with the Sefer Torah. We hear most about it starting in the 18th century. There's a book called Chemdat Yamim, which really popularizes it. This book relates teachings of the Arizal, who's coming, in the 16th century, so well before. The book itself is actually subject to some controversy, too. It got caught up in sort of the Sabbatean disputes. But here's what it says. Kol hamarbe b'chol minei smachot lifnei Sefer Torah, morer simcha lamala, ema benim smecha v'sason b'ikar, v'al ken motziim הספרי Torah ומעמידים אותם בתוך חופתם, ועושים תחילת שמחה גדולה לפני הספרים כחתן וכלה הנכנסים בתוך חופתם. And Simchat Torah, it's almost like a chuppah. We're taking out the Sifrei Torah and we're making merry the way we would at a wedding. Of course, the Torah is our book of brit, and the wedding is a human element of people making a brit to each other. We say that Ma'amad Har Sinai was in many ways similar to the chuppah of man and wife. And so all the Sifrei Torah are coming out. אחר כך ייקחו גדולי ישראל חכמי התורה, ספרי תורה, מתוך חופתם, ויפתחו פיהם בנועם קול, בשיר שפחה, עליו זמרה והודות להשם לפני הספרי תורה, ויקיפו בהם את התיבה 7 הקפות, כנגד 7 הקפות הושענא רבה. Again here, it's the elders, the wise men, the chachamim of the shul, the machers, but it sounds like the Torah machers specifically. They're taking the Sifrei Torah, they're singing, and they're encircling the bima with the Sefer Torah. It doesn't sound like they're actually dancing yet from the description. וראוי לכל עבד השם לרבות כל מיני שמחות לפני הספרי תורה, בריקוד ומפזז ומחרקר בשירים נעים, ולא יחוש על כבוד תורתו שמא ילעיגו עליו, ויתבזה בעיני המוני העם. כי אף אם הוא גדול בתורה, אולם דוד מלך המשיחה יגדל ממנו הרבה מאוד, ואף על פי כן בשעה שעלה ארון הקודש לירושלים היה מחרקר בכל עוז לפני השם. He says, David HaMelech is our role model here. If David HaMelech could sing and dance freely at the moment when the Aron Kodesh is brought to Yerushalayim, so too we, any of us, can sing and dance in front of the Sefer Torah. Now, that still doesn't mean that we have everyone who's dancing and singing in front of the Sefer Torah is exactly how it works today. It starts to touch on it. So this is what's happening in the 18th century, but it's not universal. The Chidah tells us that in fact, יניחו ספר תורה בתיבה ויהיה אצלו ירא שמיים וידו אוחזת בספר תורה כל זמן ההקפות. They'd put the Sefer Torah in the middle, on the bima effectively, and there would be hakafot, but it wasn't actually that the Sefer Torah was going to be trotted around and danced with, or in the middle of the kind of melee. The Sefer Torah was there in the center on the bima. So we have this custom that spreads and doesn't really become universal. It's still not universal. There's still synagogues where that's the practice. Also, how active the person holding the Sefer Torah is in the midst of the dancing can depend on other factors as well. For example, in Sephardi shuls, a Sefer Torah is usually in a very heavy encasement. So that also helps people perhaps take fewer liberties in moving the Sefer Torah. We even find out that in 19th century Hungary, in 19th century Romania, there's a rabbi who wants to change the minhag of the Ramah to take all the Sifrei Torah out of the Aron at the time of Kavod and only take out 7, which makes you wonder how many Sifrei Torah they had, and only take out 7 because he doesn't want everybody dancing with the Sefer Torah. He doesn't think it's Kavod Torah. Hamona am v'ladim einam noagim behem Kavod Torah kedat ma lasot. And that's why he makes this minhag. So it's a very interesting custom where we see that there's early on, in Gaonic times, there's some kind of celebration going on. By the time of the Ramah, there's already a circuit being made of the Sifrei Torah themselves around the bima in many congregations. The Chida, though, is saying that the Sefer Torah is staying in the middle and the circuits around the Sefer Torah. It's the Chemdat Yamim in the 18th century that's really spreading this idea that everyone is dancing, where originally, going back to Simchas Pesach Shoeva, it's really just the very learned or important members of the community who are going to be taking the physical lead in the Simcha. And this is a practice that grows. By the way, just an interesting note, women too took a part of this. In 17th century Germany, there was a custom of women to dance not necessarily with the Sefer Torah, but to dance on Simchat Torah. They had their own dance session on Simchat Torah in celebration of the Torah, and it specifically would single out the wives of the Chatan Torah and of the Chatan Breshit for honor. It's interesting, Rav Mervis, who's an alum of Yeshivat Czion, was recently, or has been saying that we should give mishaberach to women in a congregation on Simchat Torah to honor women as well. And it's just interesting that in Germany, it was clear that it wasn't just the man who was being honored, but it was also his wife. And women had their own ma'amad, their own place to be dancing in celebration of the Torah. Okay, well, where does this leave us now? Who should be dancing? Who should be dancing and why? And what do we really do? So in terms of what a lot of congregations do now, it's become something that really everybody in the congregation dances with the Torah, except in some cases, the women, right? So in some congregations, women celebrate Simchat Torah by watching the dancing with the Torah. And for some women, that's really a very satisfying and enriching experience, especially, I think, women who have husbands and children who are dancing and get a special kind of nachat from that. For some women, this is particularly difficult. I once had a student of mine who was a Balat Tshuva say that sometimes she felt like becoming more orthodox was a slow step of measures taking her farther and farther away from the Sefer Torah. Was sort of a painful thing to hear. Some women in some shuls dance much as they did in medieval Germany. And the dancing might be without a Sefer Torah, but at the same time, maybe in the Ezras Nashim, at the same time, Rav Avram Yosef, son of Rav Avadia Yosef, Paskin, absolutely, there's no reason why women can't dance in the Ezras Nashim on Simchas Torah as a way of celebrating the Torah. So there are women who watch, and there are women who dance without a Sefer Torah. And then more and more in recent years, there are also women who dance with a Sefer Torah. And the question becomes, why has that been so controversial? And what are the different halachic factors that come into play into trying to assess that? And sure enough, the things that we were talking about earlier in the shiur come right back. So for example, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, in a letter he wrote to Rav Shlomo Riskin about Hakafot. Apparently, originally, Rav Riskin approached him about Hakafot for women, and the Rebbe gave him some level of approbation. But then, at a little bit afterwards, he wrote that he was concerned by it because of the custom of women not going to synagogue while in Nida. So apparently, Lubavitcher Rebbe was concerned that women dancing with a Sefer Torah might be in contravention of that custom. And he himself quotes the Trumat Adeshen, who says that, well, for nachat ruach l'nashim, and when it would cause, heartbreak for women, the custom doesn't stand. And he quotes them, he says, I'm not sure that this is really such anguish for women. It makes us wonder what the Rebbe would have said today, when that might have changed in some communities, the level of anguish about it. But effectively he said, look, based on that Nida custom, I have reservations. That's something that we haven't seen applied in the discussion of men, but the Kavod Torah factor does apply to how Simchat Torah is celebrated by men as well in two very interesting tshuvas, one by Rav Yaakov Ariel and one by Rav Nachum Rabinovich, alav shalom. Rav Ariel, Yibadel lechaim tovim varukim, said, Lo yadua ma'u mekor minhag shel hagvarim lirkod im sefer Torah. I'm not really sure what the source is of the custom for men to be dancing with Sefer Torah. He's more comfortable with this original custom of, like the Chidah describes, of circulating around the bima with the Sefer Torah staying in the middle. There are great problems for anybody dancing with the Sefer Torah, he says. People are not serious, they're not careful, they're frivolous before Torah, and they take that lesson to other places. It can even lead to Sifrei Torah. Unfortunately, I've seen this. A Sifrei Torah can get damaged during the Kavod from how it's danced with. Now, what's interesting is he doesn't go into the direction of saying, well, this minhag is such a bad idea, therefore men shouldn't dance with the Sefer Torah either. It seems that he finds the minhag of men dancing with the Sefer Torah to be so entrenched that he doesn't think there's much he can do about it. But the minhag but the idea of women dancing with the Sefer Torah, which is not entrenched, he thinks maybe there's something to do. Why should women want to start doing something that it's not good for men to do, he says. Now here's what's really interesting. He says women should dance on their own. Okay, we've seen plenty of forerunners to that, even in 17th century Germany. But then he says women should dance on their own with the Sefer Torah there, just not dancing with the Sefer Torah. His solution is appropriate for women to find a way to dance. It doesn't seem like he's thrilled with that being in the shul itself. Perhaps he finds it frivolous. Fine for women to find a way to dance. It doesn't have to be that you're dancing holding the Sefer Torah, but the women can dance around the Sefer Torah. So his reservation about women and dancing with a Sefer Torah on Simchat Torah is not actually a reservation about women holding a Sefer Torah per se, about women having access to a Sefer Torah. It's more about the way that a Sefer, or holding a Sefer Torah in terms of purity or impurity. It's more about the way that handling a Sefer Torah during dancing he thinks is not desirable for anybody. Now Rav Nachum Rabinovich goes a little farther and he says, it seems in my humble opinion that if the tzibur of a given community wants to give nachat ruach to women, b'simchat Torah, ומתוך כך יבוא לתקן שבעזרת נשים אחת הנשים החשובות תחזיק בספר. And out of that, want to enact that a woman, and he says, דווקא an important woman, would hold the Sefer Torah, ואחרות תרקודנה לפניה דרך כבוד והידור, and other women would dance around her, ודאי שיש בזה תיקון, הוא תיקון שאין בו איסור כלל, שהרי מעולם לא נאסר על אנשים להחזיק ספר תורה, ושמא ילמדו מכך גם הגברים לנהוג בכבוד הראוי. Says Rav Rabinovich, if a community is interested in pursuing women dancing with the Sefer Torah, it should be done in a very careful way. It should be done with an elder member of the community holding the Sefer Torah, and women stationary, and women dancing around her. I would add that, by the way, an advantage, again, of an elder woman is if the real concern, let's say for the Lubavitcher Rebbe, is something about the custom related to Nida, if a woman is post-menopause, that's not, generally speaking, going to be an issue if those are the women who are holding the Sefer Torah. There's a way in which this connects us back to the idea that we saw originally with the celebration already in Bavel, or Simchas Beis HaShoeva, that it's specifically the more significant members of the congregation, they're the ones who have the Sefer Torah. It's not just being passed around not carefully. But then there's this remarkable line, which is taking a step farther than Rav Ariel and saying, I'm also not happy with what the men do, What I'd like to see is for the women to do this, which does include holding a Sefer Torah, and for the men to learn from what the women are doing. He sees potential in the innovation of a woman dancing specifically with the Sefer Torah in the way that he describes. He sees potential in a kind of course correction for the general practice of dancing with the Sefer Torah, which is really not simple. A third halachic factor that's raised with regard to dancing with the Sefer Torah is the matter, and specifically women, is the matter of custom. This is probably put most forcefully by Rav Tzvi Schachter of YU in America, a formidable posek, who back in the decades ago, I think the 80s, issued a psak that got signed on to by many other Roshei Yeshiva there, who said, Yesh bazeh, that in the matter of hakafot for women with the Sefer Torah, Yesh bazeh mishum shinui barur me'od bolet mimsorat avotenu. This is a clear deviation from tradition. Mishum poretz geder b'minagei Yisrael, this is really breaking our boundaries. This is going away from the way of the community. In particular, we're so careful to preserve minhagim mebeit hakneset. How could we possibly change this minhag? So Rav Schachter is basically saying, look, for a woman to dance with a Sefer Torah in shul is going against, among other things, he has a range of objections to it, but his strongest objection, perhaps, is that it's new, and it hasn't been done before, and in shul we're really careful about not doing new things. What's, of course, really striking about that is, as we've seen already, observing Simchat Torah with everybody dancing in the Sefer Torah the way that's common in many shuls is itself a relatively new innovation, and it's something that was still really being fought over up until, 150 years ago, and some shuls still don't practice that way. So it's an interesting thing that on Simchat Torah, when it comes to dancing with the Sefer Torah, we've got a sort of new-ish, in Jewish history terms, a new-ish minhag. But in effect, that can stand according to Rav Schachter, but to have women take it on would be a bridge too far. And the truth is that Rav Lichtenstein, Zatzal, similarly expressed reservations, but he expressed reservations specifically in the shul context. Rav Rimon has reported that Rav Lichtenstein permitted, and this is the practice in Migdalos, he permitted the students in Migdalos to dance with the Sefer Torah. And when they have a hachnasat Sefer Torah, that is in fact what they do. But at the same time, he had reservations about women dancing with the Sefer Torah in the shul. And that's really important because it tells us that Rav Lichtenstein actually didn't object or see a halachic issue per se with dancing with the Sefer Torah. Of course, he would want it to be done with a certain level of kavod. But he didn't see a particular problem with women doing it as opposed to men. His concern was specifically in a synagogue context, how that would fit. That leaves room for women dancing with the Sefer Torah, even on Simchat Torah, in a different context, perhaps. Well, we're still left with this question of where that leaves us now. And here's where I want to come back to COVID, and I actually want to first bring up another halachic consideration. It's easy to talk about halachic considerations against women dancing or against anyone dancing as being particularly significant here. Perhaps we're concerned about the need of custom, depending on how it's practiced. There can be genuine concern about Kavod Torah for anyone dancing with the Sefer Torah. And making changes to synagogue custom is a very delicate matter, no matter who's doing it. So all of those things are things to consider that might weigh against a woman dancing with the Sefer Torah, though they might not, because someone could argue that the need of custom is waived in many circumstances, and someone could argue, and it was never a prohibition to start with, and someone could argue that in the case of Simchat Torah, customs have changed a great deal, even in recent times, and someone could also argue that everyone needs to be working on dancing with Kavod Torah, but that's not a gendered issue per se. And even so, we have to remember that there are other halachic factors, like, for example, Elia Rabbah, when he talks about Simchat Torah, saying, Yesh lismoch l'Rabbin b'chol ma'adeh efshar b'simcha shel mitzvah. The gestalt of Simchat Torah is that we do things that aren't necessarily how we usually define synagogue comportment, and it's considered simcha shel mitzvah. The idea of nachat ruach l'nashim is not just making concessions to women, but we can say that there could be an objective value to enabling more people to dance with the Sefer Torah if it's done with care and kavod to the Torah. And that objective value can be really increasing the simcha of the Torah on Simchas Torah. Now, I think this is particularly meaningful this year with the COVID pandemic, because this year there's a question about whether anyone's going to be dancing with the Sefer Torah. And this year it's actually, I think, more likely perhaps than any other year that the Sefer Torah will remain in one person's hands and not be transferred from hand to hand, or even that the Sefer Torah is going to remain on the bima during Simchat Torah. And what that means in effect is that this year is a year where, as with so many things, we have a little time to step back and reset and to think about what we're trying to do and why. This year really affords us an opportunity to think as a community about whether or not the way that we currently celebrate Simchat Torah is appropriate for our community. Are we showing adequate kavod to the Torah in the way that we usually dance with the Sefer Torah? Can we experience the same level of simcha if no one's passing the Torah around? And if we're not frolicking holding it, but if we're dancing in a different way? And if really there's only one central figure, or the Torah is on the bima the whole time, can that still be meaningful to us? And if that's the case, is there any reason why there should be a distinction between women's opportunity to do that and men's opportunity to do that? So this year really presents a new opportunity to be thinking about whether anybody should be dancing with the Sefer Torah, and if they should be, how? And of course, there's great symbolic significance to this discussion as well, which we should take into account as we take this year to reconsider what our practice is. As we began the shiur, we saw that kavod of the Torah is not just about the scroll. It's never just about the scroll. It's about our connection to Torah in general, as symbolized by the Sefer Torah. And at the same time, Jews across the spectrum have the opportunity to show honor to the metaphysical Torah by showing honor to the physical Torah. And we really need to ask ourselves how also in a symbolic way we can make it clear within our communities that showing honor to the Torah and being close to the Torah and rejoicing over the Torah is something that every member of the community should be able to find a way to do. It's something we're going to struggle with during Corona, and it's something that we have to keep in mind at all times. Thank you so much. Chag Sameach.